You think you know the story of World War II's liberation, the iconic images of Allied forces opening the gates of Nazi concentration camps, freeing the emaciated survivors who had endured unimaginable horrors. But there's a chapter of this history that's been quietly pushed aside. A story Black American soldiers who came face to face with the depths of human evil and responded with extraordinary compassion. And what makes this story even more profound is that these men who liberated victims of Nazi racial ideology were themselves victims of American racial ideology, fighting a war for freedom abroad while of being denied basic human dignity at home. April 29, 1945, the 7th Army's 522nd Field Artillery Battalion, an all-black unit from the segregated U.S. military, was pushing through Bavaria in southern Germany, and these soldiers had already proven themselves exceptional throughout the Italian campaign and the invasion of southern France, earning commendations and respect from fellow units even as the army kept them separated from white soldiers, relegated to support roles because military leadership couldn't imagine black men as frontline combat troops. But the 522nd had distinguished itself repeatedly, and now they were advancing through the Bavarian countryside as the Third Reich crumbled around them. The men of the 522nd were part of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the most decorated unit in U.S. military history for its size and length of service, composed primarily of Japanese-American soldiers with black artillery support. And if you think about the bitter irony here, you'll understand something profound about America in 1945. Japanese Americans whose families were imprisoned in internment camps back home and black Americans who couldn't eat at the same lunch counters as white Americans, fighting side by side to defeat fascism in Europe while their own government practiced its own forms of racial oppression. These soldiers were moving through the Landsberg area when they began encountering something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Groups of starving, skeletal figures in striped uniforms wandering through the forests. People so emaciated they barely looked human. Speaking languages the soldiers didn't understand. Desperate for food and water, and at first the soldiers couldn't comprehend what they were seeing, couldn't process the reality of human beings reduced to this state. The 522nd had stumbled upon survivors from Dachau subcamps, satellite labor camps where the Nazis had worked prisoners to death, and as the Soviet army approached from the east and Allied forces closed in from the west, the SS had begun forcing prisoners on death marches, trying to move them away from advancing armies to prevent their liberation, and thousands died on these marches from starvation, disease, exhaustion, or bullets from SS guards who shot anyone who couldn't keep walking. Staff Sergeant George Oy, a Japanese-American soldier, later described the moment, saying they came across these people who looked like walking skeletons, and the soldiers immediately began sharing their rations, giving these desperate survivors whatever food they had, even though they knew the prisoners' starved bodies couldn't handle rich foods and might die from eating too much too quickly. But what else could they do when confronted with such suffering? Lieutenant Edward Ichiyama recalled opening the gates of one subcamp and being overwhelmed by the smell of death and human waste, seeing hundreds of bodies stacked like cordwood, and the living were barely distinguishable from the dead, lying in their own filth, too weak to move, and these American soldiers, black and Japanese American men who had experienced racism and discrimination their entire lives, looked into the faces of Nazi racial ideology's victims and recognized a shared humanity that their own country often denied them. The 522nd Field Artillery Battalion liberated multiple Dachau subcamps over several days, including camps at Waikirchen, Bad Tolls, and Dachau itself. And while the official liberation of the main Dachau camp is credited to the 45th Infantry Division on April 29th, the 522nd had been liberating subcamps and rescuing Death March survivors for days before that. But their role has been systematically minimized in historical accounts, overshadowed by the official narrative that focuses on white units. Here's what you need to understand about these black soldiers. They were part of America's segregated military, a system that declared them inferior, assigned them to separate units, denied them opportunities for advancement, and subjected them to constant discrimination. And many of these men came from the Jim Crow South, where they had lived under American apartheid, where they had seen black people lynched for perceived violations of racial codes, where they couldn't vote, couldn't attend decent schools, couldn't access equal justice, and now they were looking at the ultimate expression of racial hatred in these Nazi camps, seeing where the logic of racial superiority leads when taken to its horrific conclusion. The survivors these black soldiers encountered were Jews, Roma, political prisoners, homosexuals, and others the Nazis deemed unworthy of life, people who had been starved, worked to death, subjected to medical experiments, and murdered in gas chambers, and many survivors later recalled their liberation by black American soldiers with particular emotion, because they recognized that these men understood oppression in a way that transcended language barriers, that these liberators knew what it meant to be deemed inferior because of how you were born. Immigrant soldiers in the 522nd who spoke Yiddish or German could communicate with some survivors, and they translated stories of unimaginable cruelty, of families torn apart, of systematic dehumanization, of the industrial machinery of genocide, and the black soldiers listened and helped however they could, sharing food, water, blankets, medical supplies, anything they had to ease the suffering of these people they had just freed. But here's the part that should make you furious. When these soldiers returned home to America after defeating Nazi Germany, after liberating concentration camps, after proving themselves in combat repeatedly, they came back to a country that still enforced segregation, that still denied them basic civil rights, that still treated them as second-class citizens, and many of them couldn't even talk about what they had experienced because the official histories being written didn't include their contributions, didn't acknowledge that black soldiers had liberated concentration camps, didn't want to complicate the narrative of American heroism with uncomfortable truths about American racism. George Oy remembered that when they tried to tell people about what they had seen at Dachau, about the camps they had liberated, about the suffering they had witnessed, many Americans didn't want to hear it, didn't believe it, thought they were exaggerating, and the military's official reports often omitted the 522nd's role entirely, crediting only white units with liberation efforts even though the historical record clearly shows the 522nd was their first, freeing subcamps and rescuing death march survivors before the main camp's official liberation. The 522nd had earned its place in the liberation story through extraordinary service. The battalion had fought through Italy, where black soldiers proved their combat effectiveness despite being given inferior equipment and limited opportunities. They had participated in the rescue of the Lost Battalion, the famous mission where the 442nd Regimental Combat Team saved a surrounded Texas battalion at tremendous cost, losing 800 men to save 211. And they had continued fighting through France and into Germany, providing artillery support that was consistently praised for its accuracy and effectiveness. But none of this earned them equal treatment. None of this protected them from discrimination. None of this guaranteed their story would be remembered. What happened to these men after the war tells you everything about America's relationship with its black veterans. They came home to continued segregation, to violence, to a country that celebrated white veterans as heroes while subjecting black veterans to suspicion and hostility. And across the South, black veterans who had fought for democracy abroad were beaten, intimidated, and murdered for daring to assert their rights as citizens, for trying to vote, for wearing their uniforms in public, for refusing to return to the subservient roles assigned to them before the war. The GI Bill, that transformative program that built America's middle class by providing education and housing benefits to veterans, was administered in a way that systematically excluded black veterans, local administrators, particularly in the South, denied black veterans access to the best colleges, to housing loans in desirable neighborhoods, to the opportunities that white veterans received automatically, and this deliberate exclusion from post-war prosperity had generational consequences that still affect black families today, creating wealth gaps that persist decades later. But the soldiers of the 522nd carried with them the memory of what they had done, the knowledge that they had looked into the face of ultimate evil and responded with humanity, that they had freed people from hell on earth even as their own country denied them full humanity, and many of them became activists in the civil rights movement, understanding that the fight against fascism abroad was connected to the fight against racism at home, that the principles they had fought for in Europe had to be fought for in America too. It took decades for their story to receive proper recognition, decades of advocacy by veterans groups and historians who insisted on telling the complete truth about who liberated Nazi camps, and finally in 2011, the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion received official recognition for its role in liberating Dachau subcamps. But by then many of the veterans had already died, their stories untold, their contributions unacknowledged, their place in history nearly erased. Here's why this story matters so profoundly. It exposes the hypocrisy at the heart of America's World War II narrative. We celebrate that war as the fight against evil, as the moment when America saved the world from fascism. But we conveniently forget that the soldiers who fought that war came from a segregated military serving a segregated society. That black soldiers fought to defeat Nazi racial ideology while experiencing American racial ideology every single day. That we sent men to die for freedom while denying them freedom at home. The liberation of Nazi concentration camps by black American soldiers creates an unavoidable parallel. These soldiers saw the logical endpoint of racial hatred in those camps. They saw where society goes when it embraces the idea that some people are inherently inferior, that some lives don't matter, that some humans can be used and discarded, and they recognized elements of their own experience in America within that horror, not equivalent in scale or method but connected by the same fundamental denial of human dignity based on race. When survivors of the camps later testified about their liberation, many specifically remembered the black soldiers, remembered their kindness, their generosity with scarce resources, their obvious compassion for suffering, and some survivors noted the bitter irony that their liberators were themselves oppressed in their own country, that the men who freed them from Nazi racial persecution faced American racial persecution, and this recognition created bonds between some black veterans and Holocaust survivors that lasted for decades, a shared understanding of what it means to be deemed less than human. The story of the 522nd also illuminates the broader erasure of black military contributions throughout American history. This pattern of black soldiers serving with distinction, proving themselves in combat, performing acts of extraordinary courage and sacrifice, and then having their contributions minimized, forgotten, or attributed to others. It happened after the Revolutionary War, after the Civil War, after World War I, after World War II, after Korea, after Vietnam, a consistent pattern of black valor followed by white amnesia. You have to ask yourself why this erasure happens so consistently, why America struggles to acknowledge black heroism, black sacrifice, black contributions to the national story. And the answer is uncomfortable but necessary, because acknowledging black excellence, black courage, black humanity in its fullest expression undermines the racial hierarchy that America was built on, makes it harder to justify discrimination and exclusion, forces a reckoning with the contradiction between American ideals and American reality. The 522 ND's story also complicates simplistic narratives about World War II and the Holocaust. It reminds us that the fight against fascism was fought by a nation that practiced its own forms of racial oppression, that the liberators of concentration camps came from a military that wouldn't let black and white soldiers eat together, that the horror Americans felt at Nazi atrocities didn't immediately translate to horror at American racial injustice. And this complexity is important because it prevents us from using World War II as a simple story of good versus evil that lets America off the hook for its own sins. These black soldiers who liberated concentration camps understood something profound. They understood that all forms of racial hatred are connected, that the ideology that created Jim Crow and the ideology that created Dachau came from the same poisonous root, the belief that race determines human worth. And they understood that defeating fascism in Europe meant nothing if fascism's core ideas continued to flourish in America under different names. The photographs from the liberation, the ones that have survived and been preserved, show black soldiers standing among concentration camp survivors, offering comfort to people who had endured the unendurable. And in those images you can see the shared recognition of suffering, the connection between people who have both been targeted by racial hatred. And you can also see the dignity of these soldiers, men who maintained their humanity and compassion despite everything they had experienced and everything they knew awaited them back home. What the men of the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion did at Dachau and its subcamps was not just a military operation, it was an act of profound moral witness. They saw the worst of what humanity can do and they responded with the best of what humanity can be, and they did this while carrying the weight of their own oppression, while knowing that the freedom they were bringing to concentration camp survivors was freedom they themselves did not fully possess. Their story belongs in every discussion of World War II, in every lesson about the Holocaust, in every examination of American history, not as a footnote or an aside but as a central narrative that challenges us to think more deeply about freedom, about sacrifice, about who gets remembered and why, about the distance between American ideals and American practice, about the cost of racism not just to those directly targeted but to the nation's moral standing and historical honesty. You need to remember these soldiers, remember Staff Sergeant George Oy and Lieutenant Edward Ichiyama and all their fellow soldiers who liberated camps and then came home to continued oppression. Remember that they gave everything for a country that gave them scraps in return. Remember that their compassion for Holocaust survivors came not from ignorance of oppression but from intimate knowledge of it. Remember that they opened the gates of concentration camps and then returned to a country that kept other gates closed to them. This story should make you angry that these men's contributions were minimized for so long, angry that they fought to defeat fascism abroad while experiencing racism at home, angry that we nearly lost this history because the official narratives didn't want to include it, angry that even today many Americans don't know that black soldiers liberated Nazi concentration camps, and that anger should motivate you to dig deeper into history, to ask whose stories are being told and whose are being omitted, to recognize that the complete truth is always more complex and more challenging than the simplified versions we prefer. The 522nd Field Artillery Battalion's legacy connects directly to every fight for civil rights and human dignity that came after. Those soldiers returned from Europe understanding that the principles they had fought for meant nothing if they weren't applied universally, and many of them joined or supported the civil rights movement, bringing their military training, their organizational skills, and their moral authority as veterans to the fight against segregation. And when they spoke about having liberated concentration camps, they made an implicit argument that was impossible to refute. How can you deny equal rights to men who freed people from Nazi death camps? How can you claim they're inferior when they proved their excellence in the crucible of war? How can you maintain racial hierarchies after these men saw where such hierarchies ultimately led? Every time you hear the story of World War II, every time someone talks about the greatest generation or the liberation of the camps, you should think of these black soldiers, think of the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion and all the other black units whose contributions have been minimized or erased. Think of the men who defeated fascism and then came home to American apartheid. Think of the soldiers who showed extraordinary compassion to concentration camp survivors while being denied basic compassion themselves, and you should insist that their story be told, that it be taught, that it be remembered as an essential part of American history. Not because it makes us feel good, but because it tells the truth, the complicated, challenging, necessary truth about who we were and who we still are. Share this story, talk about it, make sure people know that black American soldiers liberated Nazi concentration camps, that they looked into the abyss of racial hatred and responded with humanity, that they served a country that didn't serve them, that they fought for freedom they didn't have, and that despite everything, despite the discrimination and the erasure and the injustice, they did their duty with honor and compassion, and that their story deserves to be remembered not as a footnote, but as a central chapter in the history of World War II, the Holocaust, and America's long, unfinished struggle for racial justice.